Yeah. So maybe you can just take me through a guided inquiry now, and you can just show me and our listeners what you teach. How would you instruct somebody who is obviously interested in these things and wants to understand the nature of mind or experience it directly? What's your starting point?
Yeah, well, my starting point is just to take a moment to kind of let the central nervous system kind of calm down a little bit and get some equilibrium, and just a little light touch of attention on the breath for a minute or so is really, really helpful with that. I won't, do a 20-minute guided meditation, but I would always start with just a little attention just to help the central nervous calm down and transition attention from being involved in thought, not that we're trying to stop thinking or fight thinking, but just have an alternative place of attention. So I would start there, and once one starts to feel their body and their mind settling down a little bit, then we would start to look feel more really kind of an intuitive feeling thing than trying to think it through too much or figure it out. But that the object of the meditation then really becomes on what we think or imagine is the meditator or the self, the me. And it's by starting to look at that in a precise, very, very precise way, which is, we can have thoughts about a self, we can have our beliefs, we can have a feeling, a sense of self, we can have memories and beliefs and ideas. All these seem to indicate that there's some sort of central character in the middle of our experience. And strangely, as we just sort of look for that character as something, more than simply a thought, because a thought is, after all, just a thought, that we start noticing that there doesn't seem to be a solid self-center. There's really no little man or little woman behind the eyes that's doing all this thinking and feeling and sensing, and that there's really, that in the end, to really look, there's really I guess you could call it an awareness, or almost like a kind of aware space or a conscious space where the mind keeps interjecting a self, but I just have people really look for where the mind seems to be insisting on a self. Is there one actually there in actual experience beyond a feeling of self or thoughts of self or memory or anything else? And so it's kind of a turning attention back. It's, as I say in Zen, it's sort of taking the backward step. Or back, you're just kind of letting attention sort of settle back into attention, or awareness settle into awareness.
So this will be a concept that's familiar to everyone hearing us now, but some significant percentage of them will be in a state of frustration around the instruction of turning attention upon itself. And this is something that I recommend that people do, and there are various strategies for trying to show them how to execute what seems to be a paradoxical, if not impossible, instruction. And, one is to kind of use Douglas Harding's, really more than a metaphor of having no head, where you look for your head and you fail to find it, and that can precipitate this feeling of essentially being headless, at least being headless with respect to the visual field, which is such a common reference point for defining ourselves in subject-object perception. And you can sense that where your head is supposed to be, there really is just the world. And then with that as a reference point, it's possible for people to recognize this even with eyes closed. I've come at this every which way. There's the kind of Advaita emphasis that whatever you can notice is just a modification of awareness, right? And the sense of self, obviously, can't be an exception to that. The sense of being in your head, again, is appearing in consciousness. But there's, for some number of people, I would say for most people for quite some time, these instructions kind of bounce off. They're left with this sense that they just can't figure out how to do this thing. They feel identified with this locus of attention in the head. And we've started with the breath, we're paying attention to it. There's some sense that the mind isn't totally fragmented and I can actually connect with the breath for, at least some seconds at a time. And, the game is clearly just not to get lost in thought and to come back to the breath and to be mindful of thoughts, when you can remember to do it, if only in their passing. But there's this sense that there's this kind of embattled place in the head where this source of attention that is vulnerable to the imposition of thought in every moment is just trying to aim its spotlight somewhere so as to recognize that it doesn't exist, that there is no center to awareness. And I just, I've, as you might imagine, heard from many people who are frustrated with this sense of just trying to figure out what the instruction actually is. I'm just wondering if there's more that you have to say about what the turning about is and what the recognition of awareness prior to the self-concept is like and how it's accomplished.
Yeah, well, a few you mentioned are great. The Douglas Harding no head is a really, really nice way to go about it, too, because it's so sort of non-conceptual. And like you said, you have Advaita, which is kind of at least it begins with a sort of conceptual dismantling, I guess you might say. One of the things I've found useful, and I think kind of like you probably do, Sam, is, different pointers work for different people. And they also work, timing is sort of everything as well. You can't force this stuff. But one of the ones that I like to use too is to get our experience down to just two clear things. Is if you think of, so everything we could talk about, whether it's what we feel, what we think, what we imagine, whatever effort we're making, all this sounds, tastes, sensations, all of it, if we just kind of reduce it down to, that's the content of awareness. That is the content that awareness is aware of. And then if we think of that, okay, so all of our experiences, every single one, falls into the nature of content. And then there's the context. So now we don't have to be looking for the right experience. And the context is something I try to suggest people kind of feel their way into, because I think one of the big barriers becomes our mind's attempt to understand, right? And we're taught to do that really, really well. It works good in school and at work and most things for the mind to try to understand. But I try to make it clear that really what we're doing is shifting sort of to a different part of ourselves, really kind of our different part of our brain. So if we have all experience, all sensations are content. And we can think of awareness as the context. Now, as a kind of pointer to what that might mean, you can use sound. All sounds are sounds. And then there's the hearing of the sounds. You can't hear your hearing any more than you can see your seeing, right? But all sounds are only there because there's a backdrop of silence. So the backdrop of silence would be, in this sense, the context of your hearing. Just like if you whatever we see with our eyes, the content, of course, is whatever we see, but the context would then be the scene itself. But we can't see the scene. So what do we do if we can't see the scene, right? If we can't actually grab hold of and identify the context, really then all we really need to do then is to notice our attempt to do that, and that that's been deeply conditioned or learned into our mind to try to understand, to try to sort of seize hold of of a piece of knowledge. And we can identify that, okay, that's the tendency of almost all minds. I can't grab hold of the context like that, and I can't see it any more than I can see my seeing or hear my hearing. But what if I relax the attempt to grab hold and relax for a moment the attempt to even understand or wait for some moment to happen and just relax into what it feels like to be aware. Even though awareness transcends all of our experiences of it, let's say, that's content, but as we kind of relax more into a recognition of awareness, that there are these sort of subtle senses, and otherwise it starts to feel a little more peaceful, let's say, and a little more quiet. What we're after isn't necessarily peace, it's not necessarily quiet, but as we kind of relax the gripping, it's almost like relaxing a kind of mental, psychological, and physical tension, and you start to feel the context. It starts to feel, let's say, more like space or spacious. And what I like to remind people is when you're kind of relaxing into the context, not to be too fast with the mind going, is this it? You know, because the mind will relax, but then it goes back to knowing. And so that's something worthwhile knowing, is that that's the tendency of your mind. And once you know that, you can kind of counteract that impulse when it starts to happen. Because you'll feel it in the moment as a kind of psychological moment of tension. And when you feel that tension, you know, my mind's probably trying to re-grasp. So it's really kind of a relaxing into this awareness and not trying to define it. It's almost like it has to define itself, or it has to recognize itself. So that's one way. You know, I'm sure we could both come up with, 10 or 15 or 20 different pointers for different people, depending on the nature of their mind and their grasping and their fears and all of that. But one of the most powerful things I'll tell people is just abide in the sense and the feel of awareness. Just that.
Yeah, so there's the grasping at it, or the checking at the thought, was that it, or that was it, or, the effort to prolong what may be initially glimpsed very, very briefly, to seize hold of it. Yeah, that is yet more thought or more self that's going unrecognized in that moment and obscuring this nature of awareness. I mean, one thing that's helpful, I think, in the Dzogchen teaching is to emphasize that there's one analogy of ringing a bell, where if the goal is to just hear the bell clearly, well, you just ring it once, and then that sound has its own natural duration. You don't just keep hammering the bell right. to get it to continue, and so you just ring it, and then it. So from the analogy there is the ringing of the bell is this turning attention upon itself, or looking for what's looking, or looking for your head. And the other helpful concept here from, again, this is not exclusively in Dzogchen, but it was best emphasized to me there, is that this thing is seen immediately. There's no deep within. It's not like going into the well of your mind and you're going to find this thing at the bottom. This is like an analogy which I often use. It's like the difference between looking through a window at the scene behind it, or subtly changing your plane of focus and seeing your face reflected in the glass. You don't have to go far to do that. It's difficult to describe what it is you've changed in order to change that plane of focus, but the recognition is that immediate, and really can only be that immediate. What we're talking about really is right on the surface of consciousness. It's the recognition of the context in which everything is always already appearing, beautiful or ugly, pleasant or unpleasant. And everything includes any signature of experience that seems to attest to the existence of a separate self. So the feeling of I'm right here behind my eyes, right? That feeling, that contraction in this otherwise undefined field of color and light and energy that is your sensorium, that sense of I'm the center, damn it, that is appearing. You wouldn't seem to define your experience if it were not among the contents of consciousness. And yet, just logically speaking, it's obvious that if it is among the contents of consciousness, it can't truly define what consciousness is in itself, even from its point of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the tricky part, because like the me or the imagined me is kind of a shapeshifter. You get onto it in one form, and it knows you better than you know yourself. It just kind of takes a little bit different form. So it's like the content masquerading as the context, right? And so it's so like no matter what our minds would say. But I think you made a good point. Which I really do want to re-emphasize is the immediacy of it, because it doesn't. You're right in the sense it does not depend on going to a deep state. It's not necessarily a deep meditative state. There are deep meditative states, but that's not really what we're talking about, because states themselves become part of the content.
Right.
I think that's one of the big stumbling blocks. I just use sort of a homey metaphor. I'd say the way we tend to approach this, the way I approached it when I was young, was it's like we're looking through this haystack for the needle in the haystack. Amongst all our experience, we tend to be looking for the right one, right? And it's going to be in there somewhere. And if I can just find it, then that's going to be the awakening, when actually it's the haystack. It's the whole context, or it's the context in which the haystack is standing there. And so to really kind of see the nature of the way our mind keeps turning this thing into an object to seek for, in some ways I think we're kind of it frustrates the seeking or the mind's grasping impulse, and just the idea that what we are pointing at, both you and I, is something that's absolutely immediate. It is as present now, whether we recognize it or not, as it will ever be in any experience we have, no matter how divinely beautiful or tragically chaotic. All those are experiences that arise in consciousness. And that's once we can start to, recognize, I think, the mechanism, not that that's like the secret trick, but to start to recognize this mechanism by which we keep looking for some part of experience instead of just sort of like, okay, sometimes I'll have people like, just open your eyes, and it's a little bit Douglas Harding-esque, I suppose. And, when you look, what's the intuitive felt sense of the looking, right? And the looking is just open and clear. There's really nothing to it. It's not a particular experience. It's the field in which all experiences arise. So anybody listening right now, they're looking out through their eyes. Well, the thing that's peering out, or you could go even bigger than that of no head, but you can even just go with peering through the eyes of just to feel into the nature of the looking itself. They're all little pointers in the same direction, but you never know when you hit the right little thing for the right person, right?
Yeah.
Some people, it has to be almost kind of somatic. Some people use kind of almost visual metaphors. Others, I realize, they approach it best by sort of taking the intellect and sort of dismantling the self, and no matter what the intellect comes up with as self, you can always look, okay, now what is it that recognizes that? And so I think there's basic ways, depending on basic personality types, that tend to work better.